Yes, Rowan, start.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Dennis Darling and Rowan Darling, father and son, Darling, for your music this morning. Thank you so very much, both from Montevideo, Minnesota. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the first of our 4 sessions, We Can't Breathe, Conversations on Systemic Racism. And I'm so very grateful to Dr. Joe Fagan, Professor Fagan, from Texas, the Texas A&M University, who suggested, who actually contacted ASDAC and FREC to ask in what way he might make a contribution. And so we're most appreciative. Today is Father's Day, so we want to welcome all the fathers and want to express appreciation for your giving this time. We know that part of our responsibility in this world is to father, whether we're male or female, grandmothers or grandfathers, siblings. We all have the responsibility to father. And so today is a fathering activity. So welcome on this Father's Day. It's a mothering activity as well, but we also are nationally marking this day. Most of you would be aware of our topic. It's listed in the materials on the ASDIC website. So this is an introduction to recent events. And I briefly read the topic: the complexities of Minnesota history with Native and Black communities, the Minnesota police history reform, the history of reforms without cultural change, and the history of racial injustice in Minnesota. That's what we're going to focus on in today's session. And for the remaining 4, of course, we have other topics that you will see on the website. And so we also want to know how Minnesota is a subset, a microcosm of what is happening in the nation at large, how Minnesota reflects the issues that have been with us for 530 years, starting with the first Europeans coming to the Americas and encountering the millions of Native people here. I want to recognize that I am on Lakota, Dakota land, in the homeland of the Dakota people here in Minnesota. And we live, I am situated right now near the city of Grand Rapids and near the historic village of Le Parle, which means talking waters, French phrase. And it is, as my understanding, the home of the Siskatan Sioux, or the Upper Sioux. And our guest, Beverly would be Beverly Bushhead from the Eastern Band of Chippewa Indians. Would you kindly help to situate us in the space that we're in?
Absolutely. We are in, I know there's calls from all over the country, but our small group is in Minnesota. Minnesota means sky blue waters in Dakota. We are on the lands where our Anishinaabe and Dakota relatives lived, struggled, and raised their families, and where they remain. It's important to acknowledge the land and peoples who have gone before and who are fiercely present today. Do you know why Native people say this is their land? The reason Indigenous folks say you're standing on Native land is due to the Doctrine of Discovery. It's the historical manner in which the lands were taken For those who don't know, in the 15th century, the papal bulls gave Christian explorers the right to claim lands, so-called discovered. If those lands weren't held by Christians, those inhabitants could be converted, enslaved, or killed, and all their belongings could be taken. This doctrine governs Indian law to this very day. During colonization, native nations were tricked and forced through violent means to sign treaties in exchange for the land. The United States has broken every single treaty, and that's one reason native people say give the land back. So if you're on the lands occupied by the United States, you are on native land. Does that help situate us?
Thank you. I'm now able to speak to you. Thank you, Beverly. We appreciate this reminder that we are indeed on Native land, and we appreciate the peoples and the histories whose land and territories we are now in. And with that introduction, I wish to introduce myself. My name is Nicole Guillaume. It's a name given to me by Ghanaian people on my visit in 1998 to Ghana. I'm the founder of ASDIC, which means Anti-Racism Study Dialogue Circles. And I'm a co-founder of FREC. I should say that Marjorie and I are the late Marjorie, beloved Marjorie Otto, and I are the founders of ASDIC and co-founders with others of FREC. And I'll be giving you some more information about what is upcoming with FREC momentarily. I want to recognize all those who have contributed to our being able to offer this workshop, again, especially Joe Fagan, who encouraged us to make use of his services. And so there's Joe, there's also our two interpreters, signers, Nina Noose and Melissa Lawn, and the members of our ASDIC FREC communities. Especially, I want to recognize Maria McNamara and Barb Rose and Tim Johnson and Becky Montgomery and Sue Hammersmith and Renee Pardello, and of course, Jenna Thorsett. So with that, I want to give you a word on what is upcoming. The upcoming events for ASDIC you'll find on our website. You'll also find information on the Overcoming Racism Conference on the FREC website. The conference will be on November the 13th and 14th, but what's important to know right now is that we are encouraging folk to offer workshops. There's a proposal out for workshops, and the proposals are due on July the 20th. And so I will now introduce our panelists, and we a moment ago heard from Beverly Bushyhead, who, as I said, is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Chippewa Indians, and she is a certified social justice facilitator and a member of the Urban Indian Advisory Board of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. So welcome, Beverly. Wish also to introduce Melvin Giles. Melvin is currently a community organizer with both the Friendly Streets Initiative in St. Paul and the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance. He describes himself as a cheerful, compassionate, anti-racist, peaceful love warrior who loves to play and grow food in the soil and to create peaceful public places and spaces. Welcome, welcome, Melvin. And our other panelist is Elizabeth Tannen. Elizabeth is a facilitator with ASDIC Metamorphosis, a poet and a writer, and an activist with Reclaim the Block in Minneapolis. And I know that she does other activist work in the community. And of course, our moderator with us from his home in, I think that's Tyler, Texas.
Bryan, Texas.
Ryan?
Bryan, Texas.
Bryan, Texas. Thank you, Joe. Joe is a sociologist and social theorist. I came to know Joe in 2001 when he agreed to join with us in a small workshop that we were having in Wisconsin. So it's really been wonderful knowing Joe and really feeling befriended by Joe all this time. Joe has conducted extensive research on racial and gender issues. I've been reading Joe's books on race and since actually the mid-1970s. So Joe has been around a while. Especially his research has been concerning the issues in the United States. He is currently the Ella C. McFadden Distinguished Professor at Texas A&M University. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so very much for being with us. Your contributions to this workshop are greatly appreciated. Beverly, we'd like to start with you, and then we'll go to Melvin, and then, of course, to Elizabeth. And then Joe will moderate this session, and Joe especially will join us at the time of the panel discussion. And Jenna, would you like to orient the audience in regard to how we are going to proceed for this afternoon?
Yeah, so each of the panelists will speak for about 10 minutes. And then after that time, we'll take just a brief break for the panelists to get up and do whatever they need to do. And then we'll all come back and have a discussion moderated by Joe Fegan. After that, there will be a Q&A in which audience members can participate. You can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll do that until the end of the session. And then after that, at 3:30, we'll offer an optional kind of breakout room session for everyone who wants to join. And that'll be in a separate Zoom meeting, which I'll link to in the chat. I'll give each of the panelists a 2-minute warning with a little chime, and then I'll give you a second warning when you're at time. And the last thing I want to announce is, due to the number of registrations we've received for this program, we've decided to encourage people to please register for each session individually. And that registration is now up on the website on the main page of this event. So if you could please go there and register for each session you want to participate in, then you'll get automatic confirmation emails, and it'll make everybody's time a lot easier, I think. I think that's all I have to say. We can now start with Beverly's talk.
Shio, kwe kuli. Uno dati dagodawa. Di kalango unidatsku zalagi anioya agudelena. Dano danu dasha dagotseli anatu shu shkuno dagotseli anahia. Hi, I'm Beverly Bushyhead. I'm a proud citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. I've lived in St. Paul since 1993. And I say if you've shoveled snow that many years, you're Minnesotan, despite my tribe being located in North Carolina, where I grew up. I think the Native perspective is an important perspective to share right now. American history begins with Native history. Our history lives and it breathes. We are in a very historical moment, and that's what I want to talk with you about this afternoon. As we protest to demand justice for George Floyd, against police brutality, and work to protect our neighborhoods, feed our communities, clean up the debris of protest, and explore how to transform policing, there has been a long history of brutality from the Minneapolis Police Department, and the community has a long record of resistance. This is not the first time Minneapolis rose up against police abuse. It is not the first time the city has burned. It is also not the first time a Minnesota governor sent in the National Guard troops to control his state's people. And it's not the first time Minneapolis residents took community protection into their own hands. In July of 1967, there was an uprising on Plymouth Avenue in North Minneapolis against police brutality. 2 years later, Indigenous people initiated the American Indian Movement, or AIM, in Minneapolis. The AIM Patrol policed the police and protected the urban Native American community from abuse at the hands of that police force. Because Native presence demonstrates the state's ongoing hostilities against Indigenous people and people of color, it highlights a really long history of weaponized state violence against American Indians. It is critical that Native community join in solidarity with Black people in Minnesota. The Twin Cities have Native populations that are large enough to register on the radar of city, county, and state government, as well as with the press and the public. Historically, this visibility came at a cost. There are 11 Native nations in Minnesota, and Native people in Minnesota, like Black people, became targets of police violence because of city, region, and statewide entrenched racism. We share this long-standing struggle, yet the struggle is even bigger than that. AIM became a national movement with chapters in cities like Cleveland, Milwaukee, Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco, and each chapter focused on local issues. Some demonstrations took the original chapter of AIM out of Minneapolis and into the national spotlight to draw attention to even more widespread Native concerns. Clearly, that is the hallmark of AIM leadership. Black Lives Matter has become such a movement. Those calling for justice now are echoing similar calls from the era of the civil rights movements. In fact, it was police brutality against Native people in the Twin Cities that led to the national organization, the American Indian Movement. AIM is most famous for its public demonstrations. During the recent George Floyd murder uprising, AIM moved into action to watch over the Native community and the American Indian cultural corridor that runs along Franklin Avenue and throughout the Phillips community in Minneapolis, along with other target areas housing our community's interests, supporters, and residents. Let me connect the dots of the magnitude of the alignment of shared racist actions by sharing a bit of my personal story. My people were part of the numerous tribal nations removed from the East Coast and forced to walk to Oklahoma, which was set aside by the federal government to be Indian territory. Many died on this journey, so many it was been called the Trail of Tears. My family are descendants of those that hid, fought, and we were called the remnants because our numbers never fully recovered. There are now 3 Cherokee tribes. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, my nation, still on our original lands in the mountains of North Carolina, the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and home of my distant relatives. Throughout all these years and distance, our paths have been very different, and they resulted in an evolution of the language that is unlike the original dialects, what you heard me speak. And there is the United Keetoowah Band that broke off from the Cherokee Nation to form a traditionalist tribal value. My grandparents met at Carlisle Indian Boarding School in Pennsylvania, where they were sent as part of the Indian Removal Act, and my parents were part of the Indian Relocation Act in the 60s and 70s. These were efforts of the federal government to exterminate, control, and neutralize Native culture. Under relocation, the federal government hoped to assimilate American Indians by moving them to larger cities like Denver, Chicago, and the Bay Area, and by cutting social, cultural, and political ties to reservations. As Native people, we know a lot about loss. I believe Indigenous people have wisdom to share on this. Those who know what it means to lose our world and to still live might have something to lend to a broader humanity. that now faces its own existential crises in the form of disease, climate change, and the downfall of the only civilization they have ever known. When this latest apocalypse, the coronavirus, hit, Native people posted videos on social media of themselves dancing and praying for a sick world. That's how Natives are, praying for the whole world. We believe those prayers are what hold the world in existence. With all our hearts, we believe this. The first step then to racial healing is to fully examine, reflect on, connect with the history, and use the lessons of this latest, though by far not the only murder, the murder of George Floyd. We must face the genocidal beginning of what is called the United States and the extermination efforts against indigenous people that continue to this day. And we must face the stealing of African people made to be slaves and the extermination efforts aimed at their community to this day. We must see the supremacist demands of compliance through very violent means that result in the deaths of so many. Without seeing the truth of that beginning, we cannot move forward. It will always be there simmering and will erupt throughout time until it is made right. Can you see how it repeats? Can you see how it's been applied to Natives and Blacks? It's all very familiar. Think about the vision now being ushered in through resistance and rebellion. How might you be part of creating a new and better normal? As you step forward, remember those who always bear the brunt of decisions made, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Reimagine a world where we can all thrive. Only when you've seen the painful truth of this society and how you've benefited from the racism dished out to those who look like me and other brown and Black-skinned people. Only when we have faced it together in solidarity, only then will we be grounded in truth and compassion. Frankly, it is the work of white folks to catch up to the lessons, to share them with those who you work with, speak to, and love, to defend and precious them like we do, to be part of the construction of a new and better society. The police brutality that galvanized American Indians in Minneapolis more than 50 years ago is the same police brutality that murdered George Floyd. The Native protesters marching in Minneapolis who carried burning sage, AIM flags, and hand drums in a powerful demonstration of solidarity and support. The people mobilizing to provide resources, the jingle dress dancers who honored George Floyd the next week, and the protectors who stand guard in the night, draw on decades, generations, and centuries of Indigenous resistance against state-sanctioned violence aimed at our communities and our neighbors. Violence against the Indigenous, Black, and people of color won't end without a recognition of this history of racism, and change won't happen without recognizing the historical roots of Minnesota's racially driven violence. The fact that any of us is alive today is the medicine the world needs. We are the living miracle, and our survival is the ultimate resistance. The Native community's mobilization in Minneapolis emerges another rallying cry of Indigenous activists, scholars, organizers, artists, and community members. We are still here. Understand that racism is a product of capitalism. It grew out of early capitalism's use of genocide to steal resources and land, looting on a grand scale, and then to use slaves as free labor for the plantations. Racism was constructed to justify Western and white domination, and it flourishes today as a means of dividing the working class between white and Muslim or Black and Native and immigrants or asylum seekers. The wealth divide is a structural creation. Can you see it? When you understand racism is not about individual character flaw, it is American policy. Our unity then is part of the solution. As Native people, we have endured some of the darkest chapters in history and emerged knowing who we are, where we come from, and what we stand for. We've inherited a vision so audacious, it terrifies our oppressors. It is a worldview that celebrates beauty, defiance, and tenacious resistance in the face of the people who keep trying to end us. After the pandemic, as the climate crisis unfolds. Maybe more people will understand what it means to survive and still dream, like us. I pray that for each one of you. We will continue to use our voices loudly in support for one another until Indigenous and Black lives are honored and respected. Our liberation is intertwined. I am filled with joy and gratitude for all those fighting for freedom from the killing and oppression. Solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Solidarity. Thank you. Thank you so very much, Beverly. Thank you so much. We now invite Melvin.
Wow. Thank you, Beverly, my sister. Oh, man. I can only just try to keep breathing and trying to stay grounded. When you hear the truth, it's powerful. And so thank you for speaking the truth and giving some background and setting this tone for us. My name is Melvin. I'm on the other side of the river. I'm in St. Paul, Rondo neighborhood. My family came to the Twin Cities in the late 60s by way of Chicago and Mississippi. My grandparents, sharecroppers. My father was a minister, and we came up, we was the only Giles around. I can smile today and say there's at least 3 or 4 generations of us here now. And they are doing beautiful things. And so I started with just honoring the spirit, honoring my father and mother, my grandmother, my brothers, and their beautiful children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. I think, Beverly, you invited people to become time travelers. You know, I consider myself a time traveler. And where we are right now, you know, I want to say history, but we all know that history is really his story. And so we need to start learning our story. And all of us need to start creating our story. But we have to know the truth. And for America, as you said, the root is based in genocide. The root of this land we are on before then was something beautiful. Last year, we celebrated or we acknowledged 400 years of Africans coming to America in chains. We was taught in school that, oh, they didn't come in chains, they came as indigent servants. But we all know that's not the truth. Right now, for Minnesota, we are acknowledging 100 years ago of 3 young Black boys being lynched, being hung, and the whole town of Duluth coming out. But part of that acknowledgement is people saying, we don't want to see this type of shit again, excuse me. But we just seen it with George Floyd. As a kid in the 60s, I recall being told that because of TV, people got to see police officers with German Shepherds. They got to see the evilness of the police in the South. And for many white folks, it was their first time. And they started saying, hey, we need to do something about it. But that energy and spirit only lasted so long. And then it took another couple, 10 or 20 years for them to see something else again. It could have been the killing of Dr. King. It could have been the beating of Rodney King. and more people came out again. But right now we're at this moment where people got to see 8 minutes and even close to 9 minutes of a person dying because someone just felt they had the power to do whatever. For me, I want to share with you a little bit about Rondo. Because about Rondo is something that happened all across America with the highways. Any major city that has a freeway, it also used to have a community, a thriving community of Black folks, of businesses. Kind of similar to the other celebration we're doing right now in Tulsa, kind of like Wall Street. You know, and of course, with these freeways, they didn't come in and bomb with airplanes like they did Tulsa. But in Rondo, even in Minneapolis, North Side, South Side, Highway 35, 94, the city just said, you know, we could go this other route where it won't destroy homes, but these communities are thriving too well. So Rondo is one of those communities that got destroyed by the highway in the name of technology, in the name of moving forward, in that name of manifest destiny. Another word we learned in school that meant that, you know, if you're white, you just do what you want to do. Right now, I've been encouraging my white allies to please, please have that talk. Have that talk within your family. They're all Black folks, brown folks, mixed folks. They have to have a talk with their kids about how do you survive in this racist society. And it's not about individuals, even though it is, but it's about the system. And sometimes we get so hung up about, oh, it's not me, it's not me. Sometimes you get caught up in, I'm not guilty, I don't want to be guilty. But we got to have that tough talk. I suggest that you think about the 4 agreements. To be truthful with your word, try not to take things personal, which is really hard. Don't make assumptions. And the best way not to make assumptions is just to ask them questions, or maybe start reading some books. And make sure you know what books you are reading, because some of the books are just another ways of reinforcing the standard quo. For folks who are in Minnesota, particularly Minneapolis, St. Paul, Mankato, oh man, when I think of Mankato, I have to look at Beverly. And again, I have to say, know our history. What happened in Mankato? I'm not going to tell you right now because we don't have the time. But I do want to say to folks who are living here, white folks talk to each other. And for folks of color, we need to keep talking to ourselves. And as I listened to KMOJ today, I was reminded that we got a lot of new, fresh people here who really need to listen to those who have been here for a while. So for instance, when I first started hearing about people saying they don't trust Keith Ellis, you know, that was a signal to me that that must be some white folks or it must be some other folks new. And I'm glad that people like Spike Moss and other leaders in Minneapolis came out and said, yes, we do trust and believe in Keith Ellison. In St. Paul, we done had so many powerful people. Oh, and I can't name them all, so I won't even try to name them all. But I would say to you, folks like Mahmoud Akati, okay? He is our history man. You know, we got so many great people right now, our preachers, and I know my time is getting short. So let me just say again, be a time traveler. Be like that Sankofa bird. That's for our African people. We look back so we can learn and move on. And I like, again, the challenge that Beverly has given all of us, because we have to do this together. but please, kind of get beside us or behind us. Don't try to tell us how to change or how to make a difference. We can do this if we work together. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and maybe I can share some more. So thank you very much, and peace to all.
Thank you so much, Melvin. Much appreciated. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Kogiman. Thank you so much, Beverly and Melvin. I wish I had more time to sit with with what you both shared, because there was so much in there that was so powerful and so urgent and important. But I'm not great at responding off the cuff, so I'm going to share what I prepared to share. And I just want to say first, thank you so much to Jenna and Okogiman and Maria and everyone who is making this happen behind the scenes, because it's a lot of work to put something like this together. So as Okogiman mentioned, I'm part of an organization called Reclaim the Block, which is a multiracial collective of community members who have been working for the last 2 years to move money out of the Minneapolis Police Department and into resources that build safety. We've been getting a lot of global attention lately. As one of my comrades put it, no one seems to know we're just about 15 people who usually meet in a living room. And I want to really ground in the fact that the reason we're getting this attention is because the police murdered George Floyd and then terrorized young Black and other people of color who took to the streets. So it's really exciting to have these conversations, and it's certainly an opportunity to move forward our organizing, and what it took to spark that is really tragic. I also want to say how humbled I feel to be a part of this, so humbled that I tried to weasel out of it. I called Maria and said, don't you think it should be not a white person talking about this? And she was like, well, actually, we do want to have a white person, because it's important for folks to see that white folks can be engaged in movement work. And that was really persuasive to me in particular, because I'm someone who actually came relatively late to activism. And as I think about all of the reasons why, I do think that one of them was that I didn't have a lot of models. Our mainstream civil rights history really erases most of the people who were involved, including the white folks. So I want to say that my participation in an ASDIC circle was really what sparked my commitment to racial justice. So I'm a living embodiment of how transformative that experience can be. In particular, during my first circle, Okogiman really incited me to connect with the Jewish social justice tradition. He learned that I had been raised sort of Reform secular Jewish in New York City, and that I didn't feel very connected to that, and was utterly horrified. And so it was really that exploration that led to relationships with folks at places like Jewish Community Action and others that led me to then getting involved with the new Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend Barber here in Minnesota, and then that led to participating in coordinating an action targeting Mayor Jacob Fry's office with a demand about not hiring more cops in 2018. Earlier that year, Black Visions, which Reclaim the Block works closely with, had organized an action on the day of the Super Bowl, a blockade of a light rail that I had participated in. And they'd used that event of the Super Bowl to really illustrate the pattern of Minneapolis putting corporations over residents, or profit over people, while corporations were getting all these tax breaks and sort of the red carpet rollout. Poor and Black and other marginalized people were going to be met with increased police presence. So it was following their leadership and the lifting up of that demand around policing that we decided to do that Poor People's Campaign on Mayor Fry's office and demand that he not add any more cops to the budget that year. We also dropped off copies of MPD 150's report, Enough is Enough, which if anyone on here hasn't read, I couldn't recommend it highly enough. I know Ricardo Levins Morales is going to be part of the fourth panel, I think, and is part of that group. The report really details the department's history of corruption and brutality that Beverly and Melvin both referenced, and the long line of individuals and groups that have tried and failed at reform. And I know that Minneapolis police's history is especially corrupt and colorful in all of the most horrific ways. And I also think that what is ultimately most persuasive is really the origins of policing. So it's not just police here, it's police everywhere. rooted globally in colonialism and rooted within the United States in slave patrols. And the report gets into some of that. So the work that Reclaim the Block has always tried to do, so I took part after that action, some of us who had been involved started getting together in living rooms and talking about how we could continue to try and impact the budget. And we've always tried to talk about how we as a city, the way we spend money is an expression of our values. So pointing out that when we're spending 3 times as much money on policing as we are on healthcare and housing combined, what does that say about our priorities? What does that say about the city that we want to build? So in 2019, we had a big win. Our organizing led to the funding and creation of the Office of Violence Prevention. It moved $1.1 million out of MPD. 2020 didn't go as well. Folks who were supportive of police, in particular the union and a lot of downtown business owners, anticipated us, and the council wound up adding to MPD's budget. And then MPD murdered George Floyd. And we started getting emails from people like Rihanna, which is a very bizarre sentence. And members of our policy team organized 9 members of the council to publicly vow to disband MPD. So we continue to keep pressure on the council to push them to keep their word and also to hopefully shape what the next steps will be. That will likely mean a ballot amendment to, or a ballot resolution to amend the city charter. And one of their commitments was to at least a year-long process of community engagement. They said they would engage every willing resident of Minneapolis. So we definitely didn't expect this to happen so soon. I think many of us who identify as abolitionists really think of divesting from police as a long-term strategy, a gradual strategy toward abolition, which is really a vision of transformative change at many levels. So I'm hopeful that this can open up that discussion. I wanted to share, I listened to an interview recently with Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's been a leading abolitionist scholar for decades. And in that interview, she talked about how she's rooted in the discipline of geography. And the question that guides her study and analysis is the question of why do things happen where they do? And I thought that was a really resonant question, especially here in Minnesota, where I think white people in particular have just begun in the last few years to really reckon with how we developed the extraordinary racial gaps, wealth gaps, and opportunity gaps that we have. And a big picture of that that we've been reckoning with is the history of forced segregation. So Melvin talked about the highway construction destroying Rondo. There's been research, the Mapping Prejudice Project, into racial covenants and redlining and all of these things. Ruth Gilmore uses the phrase that the organized abandonment of vulnerable communities. And I think we've seen that play out really dramatically here, especially since the 80s when changes at the federal level caused homelessness to skyrocket everywhere. And here, like a lot of other cities, rather than invest in public housing, we turn to the private neoliberal model that's led to our catastrophe today, where we have encampments everywhere, where you have I recently heard anecdotally there's 1,000 new units under construction in St. Paul, and out of those, only 5 of them will be accessible to people making $30,000 a year or less. So her question also makes me think about where I live. To bring it home a little bit, I live in the neighborhood of Phillips that Beverly referenced, close to the intersection of Franklin and Chicago. It's a pretty poor neighborhood. There are a lot of Native and Black folks, many of whom are unhoused or insecurely housed, don't have access to well-paying jobs, don't have access to good health care, good mental health care. I think it's a community Gilmore would describe as having been abandoned. And then I think about when my parents came to visit from New York in the last year and stayed at an Airbnb in Linden Hills, which feels like a completely different city. It's a really white neighborhood, it's wealthy, folks own their own homes, their kids have access to good schools, good food, all of those things. And I think about how in my neighborhood, at that intersection of Franklin and Chicago, there's police all the time. And I don't think they make people feel safe. I imagine folks would think of them as among the biggest threats to their safety. And then I think about Linden Hills. I don't know if the police have ever gone there, frankly. I mean, I've never, certainly not seen them on patrol. And my sense from walking around that neighborhood is that the folks who live there feel pretty safe. And so that makes me ask the question of, well, what makes them feel safe? What allows them to feel safe? I imagine one reason is that they know that their neighbors have their basic needs met and more. I also suspect it's because they know that there are police in my neighborhood and places like North Minneapolis that are, in their imaginations, keeping people, poor people and people of color from coming to theirs. So I just lift that up because I think as we move into this process of envisioning a new model of public safety, and we all have learning to do. I don't think anyone in Reclaim the Block thinks that we know what the perfect solution is. I certainly don't. We definitely advocate for centering the folks in my neighborhood, the folks who are most directly impacted by police violence. But I also think we have to ask folks who live in places like Linden Hills to really reckon with what it is that allows them to feel safe. And I think that means reckoning not only with racism, but with capitalism, like Beverly said. Because I think ultimately we can disband MPD, but until we address a system that depends on a class of people who are exploited and under-resourced, and that has an elite class with the wealth and the power to protect it, we're not really going to transform public safety. And I want to clarify too, I don't mean to say that everyone in Linden Hills is bad or needs to give up nice things. I think abolitionists want everyone to have nice things. And it's great to redistribute resources, but I think it's less about personal sacrifice and more about participating in movements to transform away, not just from our public safety system, but from our economic system. Can I share one more quick story, or how am I doing on time? I forgot to look. Okay. I was just going to end with a story about my dad, since it's Father's Day, and I'm always picking on him in these conversations, as Okogumon knows. I was just thinking about, and he's great, I love him, how a couple of winters ago I wore my Abolish the Police sweatshirt home, an MPD 150 creation, and my dad looked at me and said, "You don't really mean abolish the police, right?" And I was like, "Well, no, I do," and we kind of didn't push it too far. And then fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, and he texted me to share how proud he was. And he had one critique. He said, "You know, I wish that the framing of defund police wasn't so negative. It's so negative. You know, can't you be positive?" And I said, "Dad, I think it's a little late. You know, the hashtag's kind of caught on around the world, but I think he's right, and that abolitionists, you know, people like Ruth Gilmore and Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba, Black women who have been talking about abolition for decades, talk about that the goal of abolition really is positive. It's about creating conditions where we can have more humane relationships, and as Beverly said earlier, conditions where everyone can thrive." So that's my piece. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you to all the panelists, to Beverly and Melvin and Elizabeth. Beautiful jobs. Thank you very much. We're going to take a music break right now, Jenna. We're going to take a music break if Dennis and Rowan are ready. And then we will come back for our dialogue, and that will be moderated by Joe Fagan. Joe Fagan. Dennis.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you. And welcome back, panelists. And welcome back, Joe. Joe, I turn the mic over to you now.
Okay, we have, what, about 15 minutes now for the panel to get in a discussion. I think Nicole Guillaume has introduced me enough. I would only add to that that I grew up in segregationist America, which was a totalitarian racist system, and have been a recovering white male racist now, I guess, for about 60 years. So, but why don't we start with the panel, since we have such a short period of time, and y'all did a great job, I think, of covering the terrain of systemic racism, the problem. I know someone in our audience would want us to get starting fairly soon about solutions, right? And let me address it to each of you. You can talk to each other too, but if you had to pick one collective or government solution you would like to see implemented right away, right? I know there are dozens that are necessary. What would you emphasize to our audience about starting steps in solutions to this policing racism and the broader systemic racism you all touched on? Beverly, would you like to think out loud about solutions a little bit?
Of course. I really believe that many people don't know the history. It was whitewashed, and in many ways there was not an accurate illustration of what has happened, and then lots of different methods were used to complete that narrative. So media and imagery, and so we're just saturated with the belief of a narrative that we have been sold. And so like I've always thought, you know, there's target audiences like indigenous people and Black Americans, but truthfully this happened to all of us. We all have been told a story that some of us defend now to the death, and to the death and detriment of others, that if we researched it, I think we could learn a whole lot about where we stand in any place in the country, but also those around us. And then we'd make different decisions, I think, if we knew more.
So you would emphasize racial literacy, or literacy about our racist
I'd say
system?
so. Right, a very much more independent view on the perspectives in history to be shared.
Yeah, it is amazing that we're such an illiterate country on our racial history. Certainly on indigenous history, on Black history, Latino, Asian history, amazingly illiterate. You know, when I sometimes lecture in my courses, I draw a timeline, say from the founding of Jamestown, 1607 to the present. And I ask my students to estimate what period of that American history did we have destruction of Native American lands and enslavement of African Americans to work on that land. And their view is narrow, right? It's short. But if you put it on the timeline, it's 60% plus, right? More than 60% of our history is extreme violence against Native Americans and the enslavement violence of African Americans. And, you know, there's the knowledge about that history, or even to know that Jim Crow was another 22% of our history. And our whole extreme oppression history, open, violent history, is 82% of this country's history. You're right. Melvin, how about you? What would you add? What would you suggest? Would you start with the history, literacy?
That's one path for sure. However, I would say right now, people may need to use a different word, but reparations. I mean, the land was taken, people was killed. Beverly talked about the tears of trail. So we need to know our history. About 6 years ago, the former Secretary of Transportation on a national level, Secretary Fox, named Rondo community as one of those communities that is in need of not just recovery or restoring, but reparations. Right now, there's a movement in St. Paul for a land bridge. And that's putting a land bridge on top of the freeway for about a mile, even a half mile. And you can imagine if you have this green space, new green space, man. Sunlight is free. You put a couple solar gardens on that, you put a couple greenhouses on that. In St. Paul, reparations, it can mean so many different forms. It's not always about money, money, money. It's about just doing the right thing. In Rondo right now, when we talk about green space, we are talking about wealth. We are talking not just about growing food. We are talking about how do we take care of our community. And yes, we need society to do that. This past weekend, we just watched, some of us watched, how our state lawmakers did a backup. They said things out their mouth that they wanted to do, but they just did the same old thing. We had the posse. For those outside of Minnesota, we got us some lawmakers called the posse. Those are our folks of color, Asian folks, Black folks, Latino. Of course, we need some First Nation people. But the posse was saying, hey, lawmakers, this is what we can do right now. And the lawmakers said, oh, yeah. But they just did the same old thing. So I would say, Joe, that number one, to have some not just serious conversations, but to have some serious action. And the other thing I have to say for my folks of color is that we have to do stuff cheerfully. We have to do it joyfully. We can be warriors, but we have to do it cheerfully because it's the stress what's kicking our butts. We know about this virus right now. People are saying, oh yeah, it's affecting your community. It's affecting our community more because of the stress. It's the stress that brings on the unhealthy health in our body, in our minds. One of the best natural medicine is laughter, is joy, it's blowing bubbles, peace bubbles.
Well said, my friend. I have a friend who's Roy Brooks, who's the leading constitutional analyst, legal scholar. And he wrote a book and he talks about atonement plus reparations, right? That first whites have to admit to this bloody, violent land theft, labor theft history of ours. A real serious apology and recognition, right? And then he said reparations are on the plate, right? You think he's right?
Yes, I think that's following the steps of Joe Barnt, Crossroads Ministry, that's the People's Institute. The Million Man March for Black men and women, it was all about atonement for our own selves, but our country needs to atone and admit, and then again, we have to act. Words are great, but we need action. You know, if somebody steals my car and they come back and say, oh, I'm sorry for stealing your car, I'm gonna be saying, well, did you buy me a new car? Where is it? You know, if you stole the land, if you stole people from a different country, it's kind of hard to, so there's no one ideal or one way of doing things, but we have to start somewhere. And atonement is a great place to start. I'm gonna let Elizabeth share, but I love the People's Institute, Crossroads Ministry, but there's this other thing called racial sobriety. It's where it's basically saying we all need to sober up, and we need an intervention. And part of that intervention is the death and dying stages. We have to die to this way of thinking we have. And it means going through a process, but the recovery, and I'm so glad that you are a recovering racist, and other white folks need to do that without guilt. But part of it is forgiveness. And we have to start learning how to forgive ourselves, and in particular, folks of color. We have to forgive ourselves for taking so long. Oh man, Elizabeth, will you please start talking?
Yeah, well said. Elizabeth, what would you add? What would you want to add to this discussion?
Yeah,
You're very eloquent, of course, already. But.
Yeah, I don't. I think we could leave it there. I will just add, I think for white folks in particular, it can be, we can be easily paralyzed. I was just listening to an interview with Resmaa Menakem, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, and he talks about how, whiteness makes us immature in a way. And I think one of the ways that manifests is that we can become so overwhelmed. Like there's so many issues, there's so many places to contribute, and we just don't do anything. And I think that the work, I think what Beverly spoke to, the work of unlearning and relearning all of the history that was denied most of us is so important. And the healing work of like recovering from whiteness, as you put it, Joe, is also so important. And I think both of those can be lifelong projects. And so I think it's important to create communities that can hold us accountable to those projects, but also in like a praxis frame where you're putting your learnings into action, and then having people to come back and process with. And yeah, I fully agree that some form of reparations is required. I don't know how it should look, but I do think one piece, I actually work for an organization called Beacon that creates deeply affordable housing for folks coming out of homelessness. And I think that is a really urgent need if we're talking about just like what are priority policy solutions. Everything is important. Having home is so foundational, but that's something I hope that we can commit on every governmental level to committing real resources from, and obviously taking them away from police departments. How I would do it.
Well, at least we've scratched the surface of some of the solutions for this. Okay, Mon, did you want to move it to the question and answer period so we can get other people involved in this?
Yes, we can do that. We are able to allow more time for this segment if there is more that you, the panel, would like to reflect on. But yes, we are able to move to the next segment.
Would anyone on the panel like to add something or just go to the questions? I mean, we've got 319 people probably asking questions. But.
And Jenna, where ought we to start with the questions?
So panelists can open up the Q&A button on the bottom of their screen, and there are 8 questions there now, it looks like. And if you want to answer one of those questions, you can just click the button Answer Live, and then the question will be moved out of the queue. And panelists can just take those questions as they want to, according to what they feel like answering.
Beverly, there's one here that asks you about the Doctrine of Discovery. Would you like to say anything about that? Can you see that one?
So it says, at the very roots of all we're learning about today, Christians, especially Catholics, need to be open to understanding this more. How can we all unite to center much more on this big fact of our histories? I think there's a whole lot behind the Doctrine of Discovery. It is one reason why we hear presidents say God is on our side. It is another sort of tie to manifest destiny. It is believing that the Creator, and I know that's not the right word for Christians, has basically empowered this particular, based on religion, rights to other people who don't know anything about that religion, into an effort toward servitude and toward, frankly, acquiring, taking property, people, things, and owning them. And so it comes from 2 different, very contrasting values about what are you entitled to. There's an entitlement there. And I think when we see things that are happening in society that lead to the deaths of so many people of color, it's very deep to believe God said you can do this, that you have that right. It's super powerful, it's super empowering, and it feels very grounded in ethics and morality. And so I think it very much works with the narrative around who's deserving, this whole meritocracy narrative that we tell ourselves in this society. It all sort of aligns really well with who's deserving, who's right, who's criminal, who's wrong. And so I think a lot of it is very, it just sort of falls in line with this greater narrative. And I think researching it and understanding actually what I understand about Christianity is that forgiveness, someone mentioned what does atonement look like, atonement, all of those things are what I understand to be Christian values. and are not practiced or even required or commented on around society. Nobody's saying, how is that love in action? How is that forgiveness? How is that compassionate? How is that ethical? We don't ask those questions. And I mean, I think that the more we learn about our history, the less we'll be able to defend it, and the more we'll have to open some dialogue and understanding across and beyond religious lines. I don't know if that helps.
It does. Thank you.
Yes, that makes sense. And one of the things that I've been working on trying to write about is what I call the predatory ethic, right? You know, different cultures have different accents. One of my grad students and I just did a paper on the anti-Asian attacks that have come out of this pandemic, where whites come up to lots of Asians and accuse them of, you know, bringing it to the country and attacking them for wearing masks. And it's clear that in Asia, everybody wears a mask when there's a serious, you know, virus outbreak, a pandemic. It's a collective ethic, right? And part of the problem in this country is this hyper-individualistic ethic. And it really has a lot of dimensions, but one of them is that predatory ethic, not just the doctrine of discovery, but white invaders came to this continent, right, expecting to be able to grab everything, right? It's a predatory ethic. Anyway, would somebody else like to comment on one of these questions? There's one here that asks, should whites try to have friends of color? Elizabeth, what would you say about that one?
I'd love to know what Melvin and Beverly think. I mean, I think I feel very fortunate to have built relationships with folks of color. I think that's essential to being an accomplice or ally or whatever your preferred term is, to both be in community with other white folks who are doing the work, because it is hard and tricky to be in multiracial spaces as a white person. And so I think having that network of other white folks for support is super important. And being in an intimate relationship, I think, with folks of color is also important. And that just takes time. It takes time to build trust in our current conditions.
Melvin,
Beverly, do you want to
Elizabeth, can I say something to Elizabeth about that?
Sure.
I created a game that is intended to uncover people's worlds of influence, and it has to do with that. Who's in your world? Who are they colorful racially? But the question I have for you, Elizabeth, is how hard was that? How did that happen, that you became friends across a racial line? Did you initiate that? Did they initiate that? Were you just open to it and it emerged naturally? What happened there?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I can, let's see, come up with a coherent answer. I mean, I'm thought first of a woman who I consider a dear friend, who's a Black woman named Deb, who I met in an ASDIC circle. We just kind of took to each other's energy right away. In that first circle, I remember seeing each other by the bathroom and saying, I like you. So I think putting myself in multiracial spaces. Another way that I've actually begun relationships with folks of color in the community is kind of before I turned my focus to activism. I tried to engage in the writing community by I curated a reading series called 5 Writers, 5 Minute, 5 Watt for several years. And I should say, when I started that series, so it was 5 writers each reading for 5 minutes once a month, and the first series was 5 white writers, because that's who I knew, and because I didn't yet have that lens. And pretty quickly, when I look back at like the archive of who read, I see how quickly I made the turn and realized, oh shoot, this is an opportunity to really be intentionally inclusive. And so I started doing intentional outreach to writers of color in the community, many of whom were activists. So I think that had a really big impact. Also being involved with the Minnesota Prison Writers Workshop. So I don't know if this is really helpful or answering your question, Beverly, but I think intentionally seeing myself, something that Sun Young Shin talks about, the poet who edited A Good Time for the Truth, which is another resource. Maybe Jenny, you can drop the link in the chat, or I can. Talks about, when she speaks to writers, she talks about seeing yourself first as a giver to the community before someone who is taking. So what can you contribute in whatever your world is, whether you're a writer, a musician, or a a farmer, whatever it is that you do, how can you use that to create a kind of, a dynamic gift to the community that can then open up those kinds of relationships. So that's one thing I would say.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful answer.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
There's one on here, will changing our laws help at all? I ask because our legislature did nothing.
Yes. I think there's 3 countries, Germany, America, and South Africa. They are the 3 countries that legalize apartheid. Laws make a difference. We can't legislate people's hearts, but we can change the law. And part of that changing the law does take some time to understand the difference between what is defunding, what is reforming. That we have a lot of work to do, but we have to talk to each other. And I just want to acknowledge that the Twin Cities, I'm very happy that right now we got 2 great mayors who have the courage to say anti-racist, to say systematic racist. Not too many politicians, particular leaders, can even say the word. We got 2 mayors, even a governor now, who's learning how to say white supremacy. And I'm sure it's because of his lieutenant governor. We have a lot of work to do, but we have to start just naming things. But changing, yes, Joe, yes. And congratulations to our mayors. And for those, again, outside our state, St. Paul, we have, I call him MC3, Melvin Carter III. He's our little Obama. Yeah, man.
Okay, Man, shall I keep going with these questions, or did you want to moderate them? Your audio's off. Go ahead. Did you want to moderate these questions?
Nicole Guillaume, unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, I thought I was unmuted. Yes, Joe, please go ahead with the questions. Thank you.
Melvin, there's a nice one that articulates with what you just said. This one asks, do you think the U.S. is ready for a Truth, Justice, and Conciliation Commission like in South Africa? Would Minnesota be ready to set an example?
Is way long overdue. And because it's not about perfection. It's all practice, but we have to start somewhere. I recall 1995 being in Johannesburg, South Africa, a couple years after Mandela was released. And many people was very, very happy, but they was just at the beginning of trying to change their system. But yes, we need to start some type of process. And I would say this group, FREC, the Overcoming Racism workshops, is a wonderful, the dialogues is a great place to start, just even having the conversation. But we must, if we don't have First Nation people there, it doesn't mean boo-boo.
And then there's another one on here asking for practical advice. She says, a friend of mine from the Baha'i community in Minneapolis would like to be able to join an interfaith multicultural community group to share teachings about justice from our wisdom traditions and join our voices to those advocating for a community where we all can thrive. Where can we try to connect?
Joe,
Go ahead.
I know there is what is it called? Multifaith Minnesota, Multifaith Minnesota, that meets once a month. And a couple of names that may come to mind, Tom Duke, you could probably Google his name, but I'm pretty sure the group is Multifaith Minnesota. And then there's Joe Hahn. So Jenna can probably put their contact information up in the chat room. So this would be one group that I definitely know about in the Twin Cities.
Good, and I'm sure that either one of the groups, Aztec and Pratt, could come up with connections, right? Suggestions for connections. Here's a good one, and I guess any of you can deal with this one. It's why do we not teach about American racism in age-appropriate ways at all levels of K through 12, higher and professional education?
If I may, Joe, and I just a word, and I really want to hear from others. It's because if we did so, we would destroy the system.
That was sort of Beverly's point, I think, right? Would you like to add to that?
Beverly?
I think it keeps people in the lane that is helpful to the foundation that has already been built. I think there's a vested interest in maintaining that status quo, as Melvin calls it. And I think that as long as people keep going after that bone of you're against your neighbor, then there's not enough movement and joining. That's why I believe in solidarity, because as we learn this, if we all stood up, we could change the system. But as long as we believe the system is somehow going to benefit us, then we can't. And so it will never be that we can free ourselves of this particular box that we find ourselves in because we believe in the box, until we recognize there isn't a box, there never has been. We can be liberated right now if we're willing to let it go.
Yes, indeed. And there's one here that gets to the heart of the recent events, right? Is, do you have ideas on how to abolish police departments? Do you know about any US cities who have done that? And I guess radical reforms would count too, right? Thoughts about the policing issues and how to reform them or change them or eradicate them?
Elizabeth, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I would love to hear about it. But I really think that if we did historically search why police forces, where they came from, how they emerged, what were they created for, how did they get military equipment, what is all this about? If we just went back and started looking, I think we'd have a different understanding about who the protection is for, what the system is set up for. And there is a city, Newark, New Jersey, was a very dangerous city at one point, and when the police force was dismantled there, their crime went down, lots of things went down, and they had to find alternatives. The thing I always tell people is, it's very logical. If you think that you call the doctor, and the doctor has in their toolbox, they have surgery and they have medicine. That's what they have. They're never going to say, hey, Reiki works. That's just what they've got in their tool bag. When you call the police, they have control and weapons. They have things to seize and tap down the power and take control in that situation. If we continue to call police for everything and we don't ask ourselves, what is the role of these particular organizations and what does that mean to us? What are our community needs? We keep going to the same door and wondering why a mental health challenge is met with violence and control and force. But that's what they've got in the tool bag. That's what they're trained on. That's what their specialty is. And so we just need to understand what our community needs are and where to get those needs met. And that's really what defunding is about. It's about putting our resources where community needs them. It's not about saying we want to have, you know, lawlessness on the run out there. It's about saying, let's be clear about roles and lanes for everyone. Is that right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that was a perfect response. Just one other program that I would point to that I'm certainly not an expert about it, but I've heard about it, is a program in Portland called Cahoots that has, oh, sorry, there's a thunderstorm in my neighborhood all of a sudden, where folks who call with a mental health crisis actually, there are first responders who are arriving who are mental health experts rather than armed police. So I think, you know, I'm an abolitionist. I think that we can build a world without police. I also think that is long-term work, and a big part of it, like I was talking about earlier, is reinvesting resources in things like housing and mental health, and things that really create safety. And obviously, you know, violence isn't going to go away. But you know, I was just reading about the shooting in Uptown last night. You know, police didn't prevent that, right? They were able to respond, but I don't think that that police are currently actually. My dad actually compared it to the healthcare system, right? It's really about prevention. Excuse me, about responding instead of prevention. So that's all I would add.
There's another question on here about any thoughts on the potential of poor people's campaigns for building anti-racist solidarity? I guess the idea is bringing poor whites into that.
How about we flip it, and let's have whatever the opposite of poor people are. What would happen if we had a so-called wealthy 1% campaign to do the right thing? How would that look? Poor people, medium income folks, that's all we've been doing. 100 years, hundreds. We've been having these campaigns. It needs to be flipped. It needs to be flipped. We need to have those folks, and I guess people are saying the 1% or 2%. If they, I would love to see them do a march, man, in my neighborhood. You know, that would be fantastic. That's the action piece.
You know, Joe, I remember in your book, The White Racial Frame, where you said essentially the problem is the white elites. You know, it's really to their benefit to keep this problem going.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the problems with just focusing on the lower middle class cops out there. They certainly can be a problem, and there are reforms and other things to deal with their racist behavior. But they're actually controlled by elite, mostly white men, right? Elite white men created our policing system, created its norms, created it historically, a lot of them starting as slave patrols or as militias to put down indigenous rebellions, right? Our roots of our policing system are bloody and not exactly humane, right? But it's the elite white men who never get named. Like, who funds the politicians that actually have power over reforming police departments? We can sometimes name those politicians, but not the people behind them. And they tend to be what? White men with wealth and power. So I think Melvin's right. They need to be protesting, and we need to protest them, right? Call them out. Because they've been creating and funding this system now for 400 or 500 years. Right? There's another one here about, you all have been talking a lot about activism in urban areas. Any ideas for activism in rural areas? Much of the current momentum for change is coming out of urban areas, but I think we all recognize this change needs to happen across geographies. What would you say about rural areas?
I invite others, but I'm in a rural area. small town officially of about 5,000, but it looks like 8 to 10,000, but officially it's about 5,000. And I'm living in a little area across the river, the Chippewa River, that looks very, very rural, even though to get to Main Street, I need only to walk a few blocks. What we have been doing here is anti-racism circles that we're meeting every other week. I mean, that's one example. We have a very active ministerium, and so there's potential within the ministers, those ministers who would wish to speak to their congregations and work on these issues. We have had local marches happening here that have come through the Montevideo UCC, First Congregational Church. Disclaimer, I'm the pastor of that church. But they've been doing this work for many, many, many years. And so I've been here just 1 year, and their work precedes my presence. So, and they're activists in regard to land issues. I think of Amy and Paul and Robin and others. My friend, Chris Matanupa is just right there in Granite Falls. And so there's a lot of potential for work in urban areas. And so I think a lot of that has to be around organizing, bringing these people together. So we are in the heart of Republican land. This is Republican land, but the progressives are very strong here. You can name most of them, but they're very strong and they come out. And I think other rural areas have to look at, who are the people who are already on board, and how do you bring those people together?
Yeah, I don't know how much time we have left, but this may be a good one to end on for today. This woman asked, how can I build my courage and faith so that I can let go of delusional ideas, resist defensive behaviors, and learn more truths and be open to reconciliation? Kind of a spiritual question, Brian.
Practice, practice, practice.
Practice.
Practice, practice. Now it goes back to that question about should a white person be friends with a person of color? Again, I would say flip it. That same, I'm sure for folks of color at one point in their life, it's like, can I even be friends with a white person? We all have to just practice, be more loving to ourselves, but we have to be truthful with ourselves. There's too many people who call themselves being self-caring, but they are lying. Again, we just seen a lot of that with our lawmakers. They have good intentions. And when we speak, we don't blanket over, making generalizations, but being human is very hard. It's very hard. And I just recommend doing the 4 agreements, but be gentle and be loving to yourself so you can be loving to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts?
I would say be curious. Lean into what you don't know, and what you think you know, pretend you don't, and see what happens. That curiosity really leads places you can't imagine. And the other thing that I think is, remember, I believe, and this is a spiritual kind of perspective, I imagine, I believe that we're here at this time for a purpose. And part of our work is to discover that purpose and to lean into the discomfort of whatever this is making us feel, because it's really going to be healing, and it's going to lead us other places if we allow curiosity and humanity to build that compassion in us. And we can't have compassion if if someone is an other and we don't know them and we've never spoken to someone who looks like them, we really have to lean into it. And it doesn't mean you'll always be comfortable, because comfortable just affirms what you already know. You have to be willing to venture out a little bit. And I welcome that from anyone. I'm happy to answer questions.
Much wisdom there indeed. Other thoughts about this? Okay. Given you want to finish this up, or
Yes.
we're past the time now?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Joe. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we have appreciated the many responses and comments that have come through the chat room. We will be looking at that, and if there are questions that are there that we can address at one of the remaining 3 of our workshop sessions, we certainly will do that. I think Jenna also intended to have information up online. Jenna, what can you add?
Regarding the questions we're collecting?
Yes, and ways that people can continue the conversation between now and next Sunday, and how we will manage that.
Yeah, so we have a Google spreadsheet that we linked to in the email we sent out to everyone, and I'll copy that link in the chat in just a second. But we're collecting questions there, so if you have a question that didn't get answered today, you can type it into that spreadsheet, and we'll use that to help kind of shape the conversations going forward.
Jenna, would you wish to say something about what follows now in terms of the optional breakout session? So Dennis momentarily will close this session with music, and then 2 or 3 minutes following that, we'll go immediately into a breakout session. Jenna?
Yeah, so there is an optional breakout session you're welcome to join with your video and audio enabled if you want to be able to talk to people face to face. I'll post the link to that. It's a Zoom meeting in the chat box in just a minute. What you'll want to do probably is copy that link to your clipboard, then exit out of this meeting, and then stick that link to the Zoom meeting I link in your browser. So just copy it, leave the meeting, post it in your browser, and you should be able to join that meeting. We'll be dividing people up into groups of like 9 or 10 people. So join us if you want to.
And finally, I want to thank our interpreters and signers, Nina and Melissa. Thank you so very much. And a big thank you to the panelists, Beverly and Elizabeth and Melvin, and our moderator, Joe Fagan. We welcome you to join again next Sunday at the same time, encouraging you to join us at about 1:50. So we continue this conversation yet with other panelists, and Joe will be with us for all 4 conversations. So thank you so very much, everyone. And I hope you have a wonderful evening as you continue to reflect on these issues and as you remember why we are here, the very difficult, tragic events, especially the killing of George Floyd, that brings us to this moment. And of course, the collective response to that, people saying, no more, we can't breathe, we can't have more of this. We must now address it. So thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much, Joe. And Dennis.
Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Dennis, are you with us?
Peaceful thoughts, all.
Okay. Jenna, with that then, with our saying goodbye, we will then go into the breakout rooms, and Jenna has provided that information. So to our panelists, at least you, Beverly, I've not known before, and it's really been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you very much. So
Thank
to
you.
each of you, thank you, and have a good evening.
Take care.